us on Facebook at Daunta Along. Follow us on Instagram at Daunta Long. Follow us on YouTube at Daunta Along. Thank you for tuning in to Long Talk.
Good evening, everyone. And as always, we are so thankful for you taking the time to come on and join us here at Long Talk, your source for relevant dialogue without the filters, without the time sensitiveness, and without the rush, where we take the time to discuss the current events and the relevant topics that are present in today's culture and society. Well, I am your host, Daunta Long, and I am the host of Long Talk, and I'm the very proud content creator of this program because I wish that all of us can converse and be a part of a meaningful dialogue that will bring us a greater sense of understanding, that we can share our opinions concerning the topics, and that many of us may share a difference of opinions, but that's quite all right. When we are able to sit down at the table and have dialogue, I believe it opens the path for meaningful solutions to come our way. And so this is why I am so thankful for this opportunity each time. Well, listen, if you're joining me for the first time, I need you to do me a favor, if you will take the time to follow Long Talk by following our page at Daunta Long. Many of you are already watching us here on the various social media platforms. We are found broadcasting live on Facebook and YouTube. So tell many of your friends who may not be on social media that they can go to YouTube. We're live on YouTube as well for this evening's conversation. Thank you so much for many of you that are watching, that are tuning in. We have an exciting dialogue that will pick up from where we were. But before we go any further, please go ahead and subscribe, whether you're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube. Follow Daunta Long for the most relevant conversations on Long Talk. Okay? All right. Well, thank you once again. I want to say this before we start. Many of you I've seen in public, run into you in various places. I appreciate many of you that walk up to me and say, hey, listen, Daunta Long, I saw last night's broadcast. I enjoyed it. I am so thankful that this platform that has been afforded to us has been a blessing to so many different individuals. Many of you I do not know, and I've been approached even as recent as today from old classmates, many that I did not even know. But I am just thankful that each time that we're able to take advantage of this platform, we are able to make an impact in the Long Talk expression. So again, thank you so much for all of the positive encouragement that I receive from so many of you, and those that write me messages. I read them, and I pray that the solutions that we message you back do create, hopefully, new avenues that you are able to explore that will help your life moving forward. All right. Well, tonight, back by popular demand, if you joined us last Thursday, what a conversation. So many of you did tune in and were engaging us in a meaningful dialogue. And we said that we could in no wise cover all of the topics and questions that we had and so many of you raised on Thursday nights. And tonight, I do want you to continue with those conversations and those questions in the comment section. Those that are on YouTube, we're reading both platforms, so we're going to try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. But again, here tonight, we are so thankful that our guest came back, and he's here for the second time. And with no further ado, pastors, in the same city, which is McDonough, Georgia, where I do serve. And he's leading a wonderful community of believers there at the church at McDonough. Tonight, our guest once again is Pastor Jake Williams. God bless you, Pastor Jake Williams. How are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on and be a part of tonight's dialogue. I pray and trust you're having a winning week.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me back. Thank you. I look forward to the dialogue.
Goodness. What a joy it is to have you to come on and talk about the current events. And even you and I were just talking even before the show started. I enjoy, as I said to you moments ago and will continue, I enjoy the dialogue that we are able to have and we are able to share in our meaningful dialogue. And for those that may be tuned in for the very first time, Pastor Jake, will you just quickly let everybody know exactly who you are? Will you do that for us?
Absolutely. My name is Jake Williams, pastor of McDonough Church, right in McDonough, Georgia. Certainly an honor and privilege to be here. I've pastored about 12 years now, and absolutely love pastoring. Love the opportunity that we have to reach out to our community. Both you and I serve in the same community. So certainly a huge blessing to serve out to the city of McDonough, the city of Atlanta, and Georgia, and throughout the world. So yeah, absolutely a huge privilege and an honor to serve God alongside of you as well. So.
Oh boy. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and just talk with us, because I think the conversation that we began on last Thursday sparked a lot of comments and sparked a lot of discussion. And so I just really want to pick up where we left off at last week. And so if you don't mind, let's dig in real quick. On Thursday, we were talking, and you had made a reference that we're not so sure if much of what is transpiring in now our city, greater Atlanta, and across the country, and just about every metropolitan city, and believe it or not, even in many cities across the world, that there are just, I dare to say, millions of people demanding answers. Millions of people are demanding answers and wanting to be heard. Do you believe that we are raising necessary dialogue, or we are just really just doing our very best to just try to be heard at this point?
I think dialogue is always a positive. I don't think there's ever a negative in dialogue. Certainly opposing points of view or similar points of view are always great. I think it starts with dialogue. I think everything starts with dialogue. And even if you got two folks that agree completely with each other, iron sharpens iron. If you have two folks that disagree, or no matter how extreme, I certainly think that what our country has lost often is the ability to hear somebody and not necessarily be heard. Social media has increased both of those things. Our potential to be heard, but I think in many ways has decreased our desire to listen to others. I think that we've got folks, content creators and whatnot now, right? And certainly that's a great thing. But I think that we have lost our ability to have thick skin. Even the term thick skin is almost a derogatory term now. If I say toughen up or get over it or listen or have thicker skin, that's a derogatory term in many regards. And there's something to be said for this country to be able to hear different points of view, accept different points of view, and disagree in a civil, kind, loving, gentle manner, and say, I agree to disagree, and I'm still your friend. I still love you. I still care for you. But on this point, we disagree. We've lost that. We need to return back to that.
Do you think that we're going about it the wrong way as it relates to us hitting the streets and protesting and letting our voices be heard? Do you? And also, as you and I were talking earlier, also with getting out into the street and now destroying property as we saw in our city just 2 days ago. Well, actually, 3 days ago, somewhere between 3 and 2, that a local restaurant, Wendy's, there on University Avenue, right at the heart of the city of Atlanta, was destroyed and burned literally to the ground after the killing of Mr. Rayshawn Brooks. What are your thoughts on that?
Let me read the statistics in the last 14 days. One LA police officer shot in the back of the head by a rider. One active shooter fired on in Las Vegas at a courthouse. 4 St. Louis police officers shot by an active shooter. 1 New York officer struck by a vehicle. 3 Buffalo officers struck by a vehicle in front of a police station. 3 Davenport officers ambushed, 1 shot. 132 officers injured in Chicago because of a riot. 9 Pittsburgh officers injured during a riot and protesting. Several officers in Rhode Island injured during riots. 1 active shooter opened fire in Oakland Police Department. 2 officers struck in the head by projectiles in Santa Ana. 2 Richland officers struck in Virginia. 4 Prince William officers sustained injuries struck by projectiles. 1 officer struck by a brick in Albany. 7 officers injured in Sacramento. Several officers shot and injured in Lynchburg. Several Champaign, Illinois officers injured. 21 officers injured in Salt Lake. 50 Secret Service officers were injured by Molotov cocktails in D.C. 3 Denver officers run over by a vehicle. 33 New York officers injured during a riot. 6 Athens officers injured during protest. 2 Capitol officers injured during a riot. 12 Las Vegas officers injured during a riot. And 1 Federal Protective Services officer shot and killed. That's not dialogue. That's not an appropriate response on anybody's part, regardless of what happens. I get the need for dialogue. I get the horrific acts that happened to George Floyd. I get what happened in Atlanta, but this is a short list here in the last just couple weeks. I'm not sure any action warrants that reaction. So you mentioned dialogue, you mentioned conversation. I certainly think we need to have that, but I don't think what's happened here to these, hundreds of officers is okay on any stretch. And we haven't even touched the personal property. We haven't even touched the looting. We haven't even touched the burning of businesses, many of which are owned by blacks. We haven't. I mean, if Black life matters, white life matters, all life matters, then what are we doing? And why aren't we having the dialogue and the calm conversation about differences? Let's have it. Let's lead to reforms of any kind you want. That's fine. This isn't okay.
Maybe. One writer said it like this, that looting is the language or the voice of the unheard. Could it be that many are moving to these actions because they have asked for reform so many times and have been turned a deaf ear? Do you believe that if you have tried to ask or petition for conversations, I'll let you know I was just on a call with several faith leaders here in the state of Georgia, and one of the pastors in the western region, I believe it's Bartow County, particularly the city of Cartersville, said that he has been requesting a sit-down meeting with the mayor of Cartersville and the police chief, and he's been doing this for quite some time, Pastor Jake, and he said that unfortunately the mayor nor the police chief have granted him a meeting, nor his friends, nor many other concerned citizens. And
Sure.
So when it is that we find that some of our public officials maybe turn a deaf ear or a blind eye to our request, and many then begin to start looting. Again, one writer said that looting is the voice of the unheard. What other action should individuals take when they are being denied access to public officials and those that we feel can bring about reform, change, policy reversals, and other things according to that wise?
I would answer that with a question. If my house gets broken into, do I have a right to go next door and shoot my neighbor? I think that a lot of exactly. And I think that because George Floyd died doesn't allow me the right to go loot Best Buy and steal a TV. I'm not sure what those two things have to do with each other. Conversation, yes. Looting TVs out of Best Buy, Walmart, public grocery stores being destroyed. I mean, Target being destroyed, 70 COVID sites were destroyed in all these riots. Certainly think that we still have a COVID crisis. There's over 2 million cases in the last 48 hours. I don't understand what the two have to do with each other. I certainly understand that maybe there's a problem and a breakdown on, like you mentioned, with that gentleman that wanted dialogue. I don't understand what taking diapers, baby formula, televisions, and furniture out of a Walmart has to do with that, other than just get attention. And I think that there's other ways to do that. I think you probably say the same with your kids. There's a right way to get daddy's attention and a wrong way to get daddy's attention, right? And coming up and gut punching dad because you're angry and you want attention isn't a great way to do that. Asking dad for something, maybe dad's at fault and not listening, but certainly there's a right and wrong way to proceed with something. I don't know as if, again, stealing HD TVs from Best Buy is the right way to do that because of somebody's death. I think you'd probably agree as well.
Sure. I know one of the things that we talked about on that call, if I don't want to go too deep into the call, but we talked about if it is the denial of public officials to have sit-down interactions or either virtual, because many requests started even before COVID, and they've been given, then perhaps the best thing for us to do is to organize a political strategy to have those persons removed from public office.
Absolutely.
But then many times, Jake, knowing the political climate of where most of us are, sometimes that, or most times, I dare to say, is an uphill battle. And because the political climate sometimes does not afford us, and that could turn into a whole nother dialogue. Is there a happy medium if I'm not being heard, if I'm being turned away, if I'm being denied? Is there, because it does seem, if I can be honest, it does seem that when some property is destroyed, this gets the attention of not only news media, but political officials, local clergy, activists. All parties seemingly rush to the spotlight to condemn it and to ask for it to cease. But it seems like you cannot gather all of us together until someone has destroyed something, or someone has lost their life, or if there's blood in the streets. Do you think that we have a happy medium of where we can sit down and have dialogue?
I think that, well, you mentioned this last time. You mentioned two things, actually, I'll bring up last time. You mentioned the fact that you had worked on a couple local campaigns. You mentioned that to start out the last week's podcast. Mm-hmm. I think it starts with getting folks engaged in the voting process. We have a lot of folks that don't vote in this country. If you want real change, go vote. If you want change, advocate, like you mentioned earlier, where you are directly involved in campaigns. That's a great way to start. The second thing is also, you mentioned this last week, and you and I both have talked about this off camera prior. Your church was directly involved in a pretty awful crime, and the victim of that. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I wish that, although God worked through that, we ended the show last week on talking about how God worked in pretty incredible ways. I often think that I wish that your church did not have to go through that in order to get the same byproduct that you did. I wish that these cities as well didn't have to go through the same horror, even greater in that we're losing life now. We're having folks hurt. I never think that that's a great way to get attention. I don't think you're getting the right attention. I think that you're dividing the country more. I don't think, and you mentioned earlier that politicians engage in that. You're right, but what you also do is I don't know as if the engagement's in the right way. I think what you're asking, or what folks are asking for, is a spot at the table to have civil dialogue. I think when you burn a Wendy's down and then ask for civil dialogue, I don't think you get it, because I think you've lost respect by that point. In general, you go loot a Target and then say, I'd like to sit down at the table and have a civil conversation. I think that by that point, probably missed your starting point. You probably agree with that too.
Yeah. One person in the comments just said that we try to vote, but then we see voter suppression and inadequate. It can be somewhat discouraging. You know, last week we saw reports of senior citizens waiting in lines for multiple hours on one side of town, but on the other side of town, Some indicated that they were in and out within less than 10 minutes. And so I know and I've done my very best to try to say, please, friends, get out and vote, get out and vote. And then I start receiving messages, man, it's 600 people in line and there's only 4 machines working at this local precinct. And at the end of the day, nobody takes responsibility. I point the blame at the state and say that these machines are faulty. And then the office of the Secretary of State says, no, we didn't have sufficient workers. And it looks like we're just passing the buck. And to the person that's standing in line for 6 hours, I think many times my voice and your voice saying, come on, let's vote, falls on deaf ears. If I can report that I stand in line for I think this time I stood in line for about 45 minutes. Time was passed very quickly because many of my neighbors, we had an impromptu HOA meeting in the line. But while I make light of that, I don't make light of the fact that several people I know were out well past the midnight hour, simply trying to exercise their right. And Jake, as I know you and I talked about this, it just seems like we want to stay with this one issue, right? But then it opens up so many different avenues where we see inequality and suppression. I'm asking, and again, so when we stand up and many get out in the street and talk about inequality and voter suppression and equal rights and just so much, so many will say, well, exactly what are you saying? Exactly what do you want? It's kind of hard to tell people what we want because we have so many demands, right? So many demands. Everything from, again, like I said, equal rights, voter suppression, and some not caring about air pollution. We see that pollution inside of many communities where minorities are present. We see air quality just deplorable. We're on other sides of town. Air quality is, and I know a lot of people don't talk about this at all. I lift up Reverend Gerald Dirtley, who talked about this. He's on a crusade talking about why is it that in many black and brown communities that air quality is it's just terrible. We don't have adequate food supply in grocery stores. You know how you and I we pride ourselves on how we can just get to the store within 2 miles, 3 miles, and there they have fresh produce and fresh vegetation and things that we take for granted. In many neighborhoods, that's not present. And so as I go on and on now, I need to wrap it up, but I do want to say, being heard when you've got so much to say. How do we flesh all of this out where many can hear us and make sense of all of our rants and all of our concerns?
Sure. Again, there's a right and wrong way to do it. Let me ask you, the folks in I guess Chaz that took over 6 blocks forcibly in Seattle right now and formed their own country. I think the majority of Americans, from what I've seen, even in polling, 87% disagree with their tactics, which is an incredibly high number in a recent poll. Like 91% don't take them seriously. Again, I think that although they may, I don't know, have some legitimate cause there, maybe they feel like their voice is not being heard. You and I would both agree, likely, that taking over 6 or 7 city blocks in a city with over 500 houses in it and extorting the businesses there and forcibly pushing the police and everybody out, we would both say that that's not a great way to be heard, right? And in fact, if you even if you did have a legitimate message where you wanted people to take you seriously, there's a right and wrong way to be taken seriously. And even if what they wanted to say was true, I don't know if it is or not. I'll leave that up to the pundits. But even if they wanted what they want to say was true, you just delegitimized about 91% of America is laughing at you at them. 87% thinks they did this in the wrong way. You think their message is going to be heard? You think their message is going to be, debated? No, they just got dismissed. So back to voter legitimacy, voter kind of voter reform and all those things. George Floyd, all the race issues that you and I have talked about the past couple weeks. Again, a right and wrong way to be heard, a right and wrong way to voice it. Let's do this in a respectable fashion where people respect what we have to say. You and I have certainly tried to do that on this dialogue, and I think that this is creating dialogue. I wish more people did this.
Yeah, I think that the approach that we're trying to take with dialogue, I think the approach that many are taking with going to the streets and peacefully protesting, I think that even in our city of McDonough this past weekend, many faith leaders got out and held a peaceful protest to talk about making sure that our city, where you and I pastor, remains vigilant in making sure that we do not experience another unfortunate police altercation. Many don't know what happened 2 years ago with Mr. Desmond Morrow. Just a very, very unfortunate scenario that transpired. And only recently were charges dropped against him. And so, I could go on and on and on about various scenarios. And the reason why I go on and on and on is because the last question I wanted to ask you tonight, which I think is going to be a real hot topic and where I think many people are going to want to chime in on our conversation.
Yeah.
After you take a deep breath, after you have gone at this and asked 1,000 questions, at the end of the day, do we think that there is a legitimacy in systemic racism?
That sure is the buzzword lately, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
In fact, what Merriam-Webster just rewrote the definition of racism in the past couple weeks based on this fact right here. It was changed. It's been the same for decades, and it was just changed in the past couple weeks. Okay. I think that there's a million ways to dissect that. A couple things that certainly want to talk about. Just from a police perspective, and then I'll get to society as a whole. I guess from a police perspective, in recent years, police have killed an average of about 1,000 Americans per year. Of that number, half are white, 1/4 are black. About 4% involved white officer shootings of unarmed black people. In fact, last year there were 9 unarmed black Americans shot by police officers. That's it, 9. Now those lives are tragic. I'm not delegitimizing 9 deaths of a country of 330 million. That's certainly tragic, but certainly I don't think indicates a bias or a systemic issue from a police perspective. 9 Americans out of 330 million. In fact, recent studies say no systemic abuse of black suspects by cops. If anything, police officers are more, and I'm reading here, more hesitant, more reluctant to use deadly force against a black suspect than a white suspect. Manhattan Institute writes a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than a police officer. And it goes on and on and on. Do we have a systemic race issue in our police department? I don't believe so. I think the statistics follow crime. I know that's probably a hot thing to say. If you look at crime and police shootings, where crime is higher, usually inner city, you've got a higher rate of police shootings. I think what we have actually in America isn't necessarily a systemic race issue, but we have a financial issue. We also have a family issue. 67% of Americans that are black are born to single parent homes. That's tragic. Absentee fathers. That's awful. That statistic has not dropped below 60% in the last decade. Every year for the last 10 years, it's been over 60% of black Americans are born into single family households. If you look at the studies, actually, and I've got some here, actually what's interesting is that the rhetoric has changed. Rasmussen did a poll. 51% of Americans now, today, say that they believe that people are treated unfairly by police, whereas that number under Obama was at 36%. Here's the caveat, though. The statistics of police shootings haven't changed. The belief that police are more violent, 51% now versus 36% has changed, but the actual statistics haven't changed from Obama to Trump. What has changed, though, is the rhetoric. What has changed is the coverage by the news. What has changed is the media coverage of all this. So has it increased? No, statistically, it actually hasn't. People's belief of it has, but statistically, it hasn't changed. And we haven't even touched the fact that Atlanta is 51% black. We haven't touched the fact that Atlanta police force is 68% black. And Atlanta has had a black mayor and a black police chief for over 30 years. Baltimore, 68% black. Detroit, 85.3% black. Areas that folks are saying that there's oppression. Police forces in both of those cities, predominantly black by over 60%. If we have a systemic issue, if we have a police brutality issue, if we have a higher arrest issue of blacks, why is this happening under black city councils, black mayors, black police chiefs, predominantly black forces, and a black population? That doesn't point to racism. That points to maybe some police training there.
While you lift up the topic of black administrations being over local police municipalities, what has not or what cannot be ignored is that we do not see black police officers killing white individuals, nor do we see black police officers killing black men. In what did I say? Unarmed black men, unarmed white men, and we're going to make sure we use this topic of unarmed black and unarmed white. Pastor Jake, we just haven't seen black officers killing unarmed white men. We have not seen it.
Unarmed, but 96% of people shot last year were white by police officers. 4% were black. Now, I'm not sure the color of the people that shot them. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
well, that's what we're saying. And the reason why we're bringing that up is because if it were black officers killing unarmed white men, I think we'd be having this would be a totally different narrative. It would be, I dare say, and I don't even want to say, if that were the narrative. If that were the narrative. But what has been a consistent narrative has been white officers killing unarmed black men, black women, and children.
According to the Washington Post, not to disagree, but 9 unarmed blacks were killed last year. 19 unarmed whites were killed last year by police officers of the 1,000 people killed, according to the Washington Post this year. So that statistic is over double of unarmed whites killed than unarmed blacks. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that life doesn't matter. All those lives matter. That's too many people killed. But here's the other piece of this. Why were they killed? I think that matters. Why? And forget the unarmed, because there's roughly less than 30 of the 1,000 that were unarmed. Again, there's a cause and effect. We saw this past week at the Wendy's. A gentleman aimed a taser after stealing the taser and assaulting a police officer at a cop. Probably not good. When do we take personal ownership? And I'm asking you this. When can we take personal ownership that many of the people that were killed were in the middle of crimes that warranted lethal action? I don't think a police officer takes that lightly. Certainly, we go back to training, we can talk about that, but of the 28 people that were killed unarmed last year, of the 1,000, we have to assume that the remaining were killed armed or killed in the middle of acts that warranted lethal force. Can we take ownership of that? Can we say that if you aim a gun at a cop, you're probably going to get shot, or a taser at his head, you're probably going to get shot? Regardless of color, probably shouldn't assault a police officer. Probably shouldn't beat up a cop. Probably shouldn't try to run over one with a car like those other police officers do. Does that warrant lethal force in your opinion?
Yes, it does. We've seen many instances where individuals have done that were non-black, that were white.
Yep.
And I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody by using these historical terms, black and white. We're not using the terms Caucasian or African American. Here on Long Talk, we'll be real for a minute, or a little more authentic than normal. Hope no one gets offended.
Sure.
Jake, you're not offended, are you?
No.
I'm not offended. So we just haven't seen it. And I told you this. There was a man in Daunta, Georgia, that did take the taser of a police officer, aimed it at him and shot him, and he was shot. Many reports, and I've been doing a lot of investigating, and I have yet to find out exactly where was this gentleman shot. But he was shot multiple times. Many news outlets report multiple times, but he did not die. I think anytime we see someone running away, and we shoot them in the back, it's very fair to say that was a shoot to kill. Where the other dynamic of what I said earlier, we do see, according to your stat, that there were way more white persons arrested by. Read that stat to me again, if you don't mind. You said.
Which one?
Where you said only nine have been killed, but you said
9 unarmed blacks were killed last year.
Mm-hmm.
19 unarmed whites were killed last year by police, according to the Washington Post.
Yeah, and I read that article a couple months ago. I think another article came out that said that of those 19, not one was killed by a black officer. I think 4 of them were killed by a Hispanic officer. Some other number by I think one was a Korean, one was, can't remember the other nationality. But what was striking in that report that was originated from the Washington Post is that out of those 19, 0 were killed by African American or black police officers. And so,
does that point to racism, though? Do you think a cop thinks, black guy with a gun, I should shoot him, versus white guy with a gun? I guess I'm asking the question because, gosh, that's a tough one, isn't it? I mean,
when you look at the number 19, 0 for 19. If there was any statistic where someone was 0 for 19, we would say pretty bad, right?
That's the unarmed. There's over 900 that were not unarmed.
Okay.
And I have to assume that of the 900, at least one black man shot a white guy. I don't think 0 for 900 is probably
Yeah, I think we're only concentrating on the 19 that were white, the 9 that were black.
Unarmed.
And I'm sorry, I did not investigate and do more. I'm just really extemporaneously remembering things that I read some time ago. I think the striking point of why people are marching in the street is to say we haven't seen where the black officers have shot and killed the white unarmed black men and white men and white women. We have not seen that by and large, but we've seen a consistent pattern over the last, many. Some will go as far as to say it has never stopped. Whether the numbers have flatlined, decreased for a little era, increased for one era, but I think all would say that number has never stopped, right? But the reason why the attention is really heightened is because there seems to be a pattern. There seems to be a continuation. There seems to be an ongoing series of events that are just pointing to this one single issue, that unarmed black men, women, and children are being shot and killed
There were
Not
9 last year.
not just shot, but shot and killed.
There were 9 out of 330 million Americans. There were 9. That's tragic again. But be honest, if you're going to talk percents, then 9 out of 330 million is a point decimal and then a bunch of zeros and then a small number after that. I'm not sure if you got a calculator, do the math, but what's 9 divided by like 330 million Americans? We're going to come to a very, very, very small fraction. I don't know as if here's my point. Is it a dialogue that needs to be had? Yes. Is it being given, if you're talking 9 out of 330 million, is it maybe giving some undue weight? Yes. I think if you and I, back to statistics, said lightning has struck Americans 9 times out of 330 million strikes. It's killed 9 Americans out of 330 million. You would say, gosh, I don't have a very big chance of getting struck by lightning. My point is if 9 unarmed black people have been killed out of 330 Americans roughly, then unarmed blacks don't have a very high likelihood of being shot and killed. Why are we burning cities down if that's the stat? Why are we giving so much weight to the conversation if we're talking 9 out of 330 million? Do you think that that's an undue weight?
I'm really at this point asking many that are watching this.
Sure.
Many are saying that they wish to check the validity of
Sure.
that statistic 9, and so I'm going to ask many of you that are watching, whether you're on Facebook and YouTube, if you will fact check that just to see. Not speaking to your integrity at all, but you know, in the information age, we do wish to fact check how many unarmed. I'm simply saying that it appears that what has happened in 2019, we see here it is.
Washington Post, June 8th, when that article.
Okay. Yeah.
Certainly don't know. I don't know who collected the information at Washington Post, but certainly a fairly large publication.
Yeah, there's another article that simply says 9. What we are saying, though, before it gets any worse, or we continue to see, because it looks like a pattern here, even if this number is just 9, okay? I think meteorologists would spend more money, would do whatever they need to do to look at why 9 people are being struck by lightning all of a sudden when the national average may be less, 50% or 60% less than that. So
Sure.
I don't wish to just look at it and say that we're looking at all of this to say that, well, since the numbers are low, then I think we just need to we need to just look at this and say, well, not that big of a deal. I
agree with you too, but the conversation also goes back to child poverty, right? Mm-hmm. Duke University did a study since 1979. That's a long time, all the way up to present, that said that higher levels of wealth were associated with lower levels of incarceration, regardless of race and ethnicity. Fatherlessness is the most common cause of poverty in the United States. We're going back to this single child home thing, correct? So incarceration tends to follow economic levels, and I'm not assaulting the rich. I'm certainly not saying anything wrong about being wealthy. The Bible makes a very clear case that rich and poor is both fine, correct?
Right.
The love of money, the Bible talks about, not money itself, as being evil. So the point is, though, when do we get to the conversation that talks about single homes or single parent homes? When do we get the conversation that talks about the fact that that poverty is a big deal and we need to fight that? Back to the church, as a pastor's perspective, what can we do better in our communities to help fight poverty? For example, they did a study fairly recently from West Indian blacks that moved here. You probably saw that same study. But West Indian blacks that moved here from like Jamaica, Caribbean, Barbados, whatnot, they did a study and found that black community compared to the American or African American black community, whatever you want to call it, the West Indian black community predominantly came from two-person homes. They were more socially conservative. The parents were stricter overall in their discipline, and they outperformed whites and black both on many levels of income, many levels of high school graduation, college graduation. What's that to be said about the American community versus those that are also black that migrated here that statistically have done better? Is that a racism issue, or is that maybe a social construct that we need to work on when it comes to family structure, poverty, fighting poverty as a church as a whole, and education?
Well, this goes back to some of the research that both you and I were doing before we started our dialogue a couple of weeks ago.
Sure.
That mass incarceration has been the number one. Let's be clear about that. Has been the number one reason why black men are not the father inside of the home.
Sure. But that also predicates it feeds itself, the chicken or the egg, because fatherless homes are also the leading cause of mass incarceration. Actually, the leading cause of poverty, which is the leading cause of mass incarceration. The two are based on each other. Yeah. So you could say you pull the father out of the home, it leads to incarceration, or the fact that the father wasn't in the home leads to incarceration. I don't know.
Jake, I think this is why we use the word systemic.
I think that goes back to a system, though. Look, my father came from an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic. My grandfather was abusive. My father was the first to go to college in his entire family as far back as you can go. They were poor farmers, poor factory workers. My dad did not, and I say this not braggingly, but I'm proud of him. He had a tougher battle to get to where he is, right? He had a bigger uphill climb than somebody else might have had. I mentioned that to say that there comes a point when you have to own you. And there comes a point when I love stories like Ben Carson's a great example of that. His worked pretty high up in our country. Whether you like the guy or not, he's done pretty darn well. There has to come a point when you look at folks that have risen out of difficulty and did not allow difficulty or society or rough neighborhoods or crime or drugs or gangs or poverty to define them. Mm-hmm. At what point do we get to where we say, look, I may have a bigger uphill climb. My life may be more difficult, but like my dad, where he said, look, I'm not going to let an alcoholic, abusive father that hit me and beat me, I'm not going to let that define me. I'm going to choose my destiny, and I'm going to slug my way there, and I will not take no for an answer. At what point do we take responsibility for that and say, look, maybe the system is, you could make a case. And again, the systemic racism is certainly going around our society, but even if it was true, at what point do you take personal responsibility and say, okay, fine, the chips are stacked against me, but that doesn't define who I am. I define who I am. God defines who I am, and I will overcome that.
I think the reason why we use the word systemic to really help others see the weight of what we are facing. Because we talk about the mass incarceration, we talk about the fatherlessness. We also talk about the drug use. Sure. We also talk about the low income paying jobs. We also talk about the non-performing schools. We also talk about the redlining as it relates to redistricting for children to go to school and for affordable housing. And by the time you have meaningful dialogue, and Jake, we could go on for the rest of the month, and I dare say the rest of the year, untackling and really opening up all of these systemic problems. And the reason why we say systemic, because if it were just 19, if it was just 9, you make a fair argument, right? And I did read the Washington Post. You are correct, but it's still disproportionate. All right, we won't go back into it. It's still disproportionate. But the reason why we say systemic racism is because it's not just happening to 9 or 19 or not even 900 or not even 9,000. We see in every major city in this country that children who are not afforded the same education where others are given that opportunity. And my personal belief is that it starts with education. When we are not given the same playing field, yes, you're going to say I got to work harder, but everybody doesn't have the capacity to work harder. There will be some that feel as though there will be many, if not all, that feel that everyone should receive or play on the same playing field. And it really becomes overwhelming. It becomes overwhelming when we start talking about many of these issues. Because if it were just one obstacle to face, if it was just I didn't have a father, well, then maybe I could rely on my uncle. But then if I go to a terrible school with no good teachers, well, then I can't just up and cross town and go to the performing school. Municipalities have rules in place. I can't just get up and transfer and go to the other side where the school is performing. I don't have enough money because I live in a low income community to just get up and go move. It's not that easy, right? And so I know that we hear this message and all of us preach, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But quite frankly, a lot of people are like the children of Israel. They've been wandering around in the wilderness and not even knowing where they're going. And a lot of this is no fault of their own. It has become a systemic issue.
I still differ. We'll agree to disagree on that because I still think that doesn't explain the West Indian black immigrants that came here that do better. If we're judging people on skin color and you're saying if that's what we're looking at, we're saying, look, because the color of your skin, therefore that should dictate how high you travel. If we're saying that because of the color of your skin, that also dictates the uphill battle that you're going to face due to culture, due to schools, due to all those things, then that doesn't, I mean, gosh, I would say that you and I here in the United States have it pretty good compared to a lot of places in the Caribbean. They get leveled by hurricanes every couple of years. I've traveled to many of those places. They have got it pretty bad. And when they come here with even less than we have being born here, and they make it higher than many of the citizens that were born here in America with the same skin color, I don't know what that explains, and certainly, again, that might lead to maybe another conversation. But they live in a lot of the same neighborhoods as well, and they live in a lot of the same areas, go to the same schools, and seem to perform better than even many whites do, many blacks do, than many other individuals do in school, in income, having that same, if not a greater, uphill battle, given the fact that they came here often with very little.
I think you're right. It's due another conversation because when you look at lending practices, I think it's very clear as to why many other nationalities tend to do well. Jake, I can walk into the bank right now and sign up for as much student loan financing that I would care to borrow, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But if I try to go and take out money for a loan to start a small business, I'm not sure that I'll have that open check signed to my name as I would if I were trying to secure student loan.
I can say that I went to flight school. My parents second mortgaged their house. I was 18 years old. If I had a different skin color, flight school would have been completely paid for. My parents wouldn't have had to second mortgage their house, and I would have been put in the right seat of a jet a year and a half later and made over $100,000 a year and a half after starting flying. Instead, my parents second mortgaged their house. I made $19,000 my first year flying for an airline. $19,000. The flight attendants made more than I did. My parents continued to help finance and pay for my loan because I couldn't afford to do so. I had to flight instruct 6 years to get to where I wanted to be. And again, made $19,000 my first year, only because I was a white male and did not have the same scholarships, the same freedoms as if I were another color and a minority. I think that we could probably go round and round again by inequality, but certainly I was the victim in that case, or if you want to call it that. I don't think going to flight school is a victim of anything, and flying jets around the country is not a victim of anything. But I'm saying that I suffered a much more difficult path to get to where I wanted to go and where I was going than if I had been a minority. That was certainly hard. And you go back to lending money, I think it cuts both ways in many regards. The percent of what it cuts, I don't know. I'm a real estate agent. I've helped clients of all nationalities, all colors, all races. But certainly I had a much harder time in flight school, had a much harder time financially. It took me 10 years to get to where I needed to be after flight instructing and working my way up than it would have if I had just had the year and a half with a different skin color. But whatever, that's a whole other conversation there too.
Yeah. To kind of bring it back in when we talk about the systemicness,
Sure.
I think it comes to the key components, and not to discount your personal testimony. Time will not allow me and afford me the opportunity to tell you my heart story.
Sure.
It is what it is, as we say. Long talk, real talk. I didn't have the easy path. George Robert Frost said that I took the path less traveled.
Absolutely, yeah.
Suffice that to say. But everybody has not had the same intuitiveness, charismatic, God-given skill that you and I have shared, and that's why I don't never take. That's why I never deem myself as having pulled myself up by the bootstraps. If a lot of people did not provide, as you said, your dad did for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gosh, it's very tempting because I don't want to sound pious by not telling my story, but I promise you, I am not who I am today if it had not been for individuals giving me a hand up and allowing me to press my way.
Yep.
Jake, I think again, as we bring this conversation to a close, we're simply just trying to bring awareness to what is transpiring.
Absolutely.
I want to say to you, I appreciate you having courage enough to come on and talk. A lot of people are not interested, as I said in our first dialogue. So many just want to look at the situation, talk about the situation, but not really deal with. I appreciate you taking the courage to say that last week when individuals stood by in silence that it was wrong. That took a lot of courage for you to say that, and I appreciate you for saying that. For you today to even say that you're not sure if it is, which means you're at least giving some thought to it. Here on Long Talk, I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not trying to go hard at you and try to rail you for feeling the way, and I don't feel that you've done the same. But I think it's what I've been happy with the results of our conversation as we bring it to a close is simply for you to say, yes, I'm not sure. And maybe we have to keep the conversation going so that we can talk about, well, these are the circumstances. These are the events. If it is only 9, but why is it that no unarmed white person has been killed by a black officer? Not making it right or wrong, but when we raise these questions, it at least causes all of us to think. The media has done a job on us when it comes to racism, when it comes to COVID-19, when it comes to so much. The news media, and I'm not here to bash pundits and journalists because many of my friends are. No shade to you. You know how I feel about journalists. They see a hard time. But it is their job to heighten whatever's transpiring, to draw real attention to it, right? And so that's the reason. And I think, as you said, all of us agree that there's a right way to do this, right? And peacefully protesting, requesting dialogue, as I did to you and you accepted. But unfortunately, a lot of our political officials do not wish to sit down and have necessary dialogue. That's troubling, and that's why so many will say that it seems to be systemic. If I say please, 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 and you turn a deaf ear and a blind eye, no, I don't want to tear the house down. But then if I start screaming, right? And you say, whoa, why are you screaming? Lower your voice. Maybe it took me to raise my voice, so that you can at least say, okay, let me see what this guy wants at least, right? And so I think we do see individuals taking to the streets. As I said last week, I believe this is actually scriptural, because it said in the last days your sons and your daughters will get out and prophesy, which means they will speak the truth. They will, and then those of us who are believers of Christ, when we cry out against injustice, when we say wrong is wrong, no matter who does it, if they're black, if they're white, if they're Hispanic, Korean, Asian, whatever their nationality is, whether they're a man, whether they're a woman, whether they're whatever their nationality is, whatever their ethnicity is, whether they're clergy, there's a lot of abuse that happens from our positions. And so wrong is wrong no matter who does it and who it is done to. There is no excuse. There is no excuse for the 9. There is no excuse for the 900 or the 3,000 as all of it is transpiring. There's just no excuse. And I think it is our job to sound our voice. Do you agree with that?
I do. Can I say something as well in closing? Jesus looked nothing like you or I. He came from a different descent probably than you and I did, right?
Right.
And I think you and I can both agree that the Bible talks about as a believer being known by our love, not necessarily our skin color, or any of that. I think that as a believers, I think the in conversation has been great. The dialogue's been great. I think the net of the whole thing is I think you and I have a lot more in common. Certainly, we've talked about this off camera than we have in disagreement. And that's the fact that souls matter, regardless of skin color, regardless of age, regardless of nationality, race, all those things. Souls matter. Christ died for all. We're going to spend eternity together, and that's the beautiful thing. And the heaven's a very diverse place. And I think you and I can both agree that the conversation's good, but I hope that it doesn't ever get to a point where it's a distraction to where we turn our attention from souls and the fact that our job is to win. Our time is short, and our job is to win people for Christ, and we turn it on other things that are more of a distraction. I hope we're not distracted. I hope we can walk and chew gum at the same time and have meaningful dialogue about things like this, and also have the meaningful dialogue that says, look, I love you. I don't care who you are. I don't care where you came from. I don't care anything about that. I just want you to know the Jesus that I know, and I can't wait to spend eternity with you, and I hope that you know his death, burial, and resurrection was for you. So I think we both agree on a lot more than certainly we disagree on, but the conversation has been great. And again, Christ looked nothing like you or I. But that didn't matter, did it? He came for all.
Yeah. I think he did come for all, but I do like the fact that what Luke's gospel says is that he came to preach to those that are bound, to those that are oppressed, to those that are disenfranchised, to those that are being systemically oppressed. And I think the focus of Christ's message is for us to preach a message of justice for all.
I agree. And to those that are dead in sin.
Yeah, and to those that are dead in sin. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so we're going to continue to lift our voice. We're going to continue to get out and speak truth to power. We're going to continue to warn those who are unruly. Paul gives us, he says, warn the unruly. If we see you destroying property, listen, no, don't destroy the property. It's a way that you can do this. It's a way that you can get out and speak truth to power. It's a way that we can change voter suppression. There is a way that we can look at how districts are drawn. It's a way that we can involve ourselves more in our community, even though the schools are low performing. It's a way that we can galvanize. And so it's always going to be counterintuitive. We're going to say to those of us that feel the call, we must do better. But we're going to say to those who oppress, please take your foot off of our necks, right? And this will be like you said, walking and chewing gum. We're walking to continue to forge our way forward, and we're chewing the gum because we don't want to spit the gum. We don't want to spit on anybody. I think it was disheartening to watch that woman in the suburbs of Wisconsin, who was a lawyer, spit on a 15-year-old young black male. That was extremely desecrating. Long are the days, I thought, America, long were the days when we spit on each other, when we sick dogs unleashed high-pressure water hoses. You would think that we were in the days of the 60s, perhaps. But, man, I guess if you don't learn your lesson the first time, you have to repeat it. And that's not to put onus on those who are oppressed. Maybe this is the opportunity for those that oppressed before, that they can look at what they did and say, now we must change. Hopefully that's where we are. Pastor Jake, thank you so much for taking the time to dialogue with us.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Enjoy the rest of the balance of the night.
Thank you.
Friends, thank you all so very much for taking the time to come on and talk about these tough issues. It's never easy when we discuss the trouble that is facing us. It's not easy. And many times we'll do it with tears in our eyes. Many times we'll do it not being able to articulate it like we're doing here on Long Talk. Maybe we will raise our voice. Maybe we will demand justice and say we won't take it any longer. But we must know that we cannot negate at any point. Hear me. We cannot negate at any point to speak truth to power. We can never negate the fact that we must press forward to make sure that all have equality. This is the message of Jesus Christ. He came to loose the chains. He came to set the captive free, give sight to the blind, unclog deaf ears, and do good to all that needed it. And to forgive sins. Make sure I put that in there. Yeah. Foremost, he came to forgive sins. And this is the message that we preach. And at the expense of Long Talk not sounding like a sermon, I'll stop there. But I do want to say that our prayers are with the nation during this time, that we will wake up, that we will listen, that we will engage in meaningful dialogue like we did here tonight and like we've been doing for the last several weeks. And I think that when we engage in this dialogue, we can at least have conversation to spark change. All right? Well, listen, I need you before we go, please subscribe as we have more meaningful dialogue, more guests. Many are asking the question, what's getting ready to happen with the school system? And we've got some guests that will be talking to many of the needs for your children that are preparing for this next school year. So many questions are, we don't know what this next school year is going to look like. And so here at Long Talk, we have already engaged and confirmed many individuals from many different local school municipalities. And so I need you to stay engaged. I need you to subscribe because you don't want to miss very, very pertinent information that's going to be shared every Tuesday night and Thursday night at 7:30 p.m. All right? Well, go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and follow. Go ahead and share, as I know that you wish to continue to be a part of this wonderful dialogue. Well, I've got to run. I've enjoyed this. Join me Thursday night, 7:30 p.m. for another edition of Long Talk. God bless you.
Follow us on Facebook at Daunta A. Long. Follow us on Instagram at Daunta Long. Follow us on YouTube at Daunta A. Long. Thank you for tuning in to Long Talk.